Good morning, Andrew. You're muted, I think. Yes.
Hello. Hello.
Hi, Andrew.
Nice to meet you, Nippin. Yes. Where are you physically? I don't know.
I'm in Aberdeen.
Oh, okay. All right. I've been to Aberdeen numerous times. Yes.
Yes, I missed the opportunity when you were here presenting to the offshore Europe. I know you were here a few years ago, uh, but I somehow, couldn't make it to the to your talk. But very nice to
Okay.
see you, and thank you for joining. It must be very early in the morning where you are.
Yes, it's 6:45. It's just getting light. You can probably see the light behind me.
I can,
Daylight.
yes. Yes. We don't get to see much light here in Scotland during the winter.
No, I guess you don't. You're far north, very far north. Yes. Yeah.
Are you
So,
originally from Australia?
yeah, I'm an Australian. Yes.
Okay.
Um, I live in Canberra. I've spent most of my life in Canberra. Worked at grew up in Canberra and went to the Australian National University in Canberra. And then I did a PhD in the United States, and I worked a bit in Melbourne and in Sydney, but most of my life I've worked at the ANU, so at the Australian National University. I'm retired now.
Right, right. That must be
And you?
nice.
Oh, well, I'm still still working. Mm. What
Yes,
about you?
I was.
Where are you?
Yeah, I was a seafarer for 11 years. I used to work on deep sea ships, and then I don't know, for some reason the Seafarers International Research Center at Cardiff University saw something in me, and they offered me a PhD program for 4 years, funded by the Nippon Foundation of Japan. So that was very fortunate to study the School of Social Sciences in Cardiff.
Cardiff.
Uh,
Okay. Yeah, I know the guy who was a professor there, Nick Pigeon. Did you come across that name?
no, no, I
Oh,
haven't.
okay.
I used to
Mm,
be with Helen Sampson, Professor Helen Sampson, and she's heavily into the maritime world,
okay.
um, coming from a very social science perspective. And so
Yes.
I spent, I did my PhD, I did a master's in economics as well from there. But and then
Mm.
I spent about 7 years in the UK continental shelf, just putting some of this curiosity into practice and just trying to understand how things work from the in the drilling world. So I used to go on big ships and drilling rigs to do safety management system inspections and audits. And I just fell in love with your work. One of your
Oh,
books was around the learning from failure was one, but the other one that was very timely to me was disastrous decisions.
mm, mm.
And I saw parallels between your work and a study I undertook about 3 years ago on the Costa Concordia case, a passenger ship that capsized off Italy. I
Yes.
interviewed the captain of the ship, and and I saw some very interesting parallels between your work and the cruise industry. And one of the things that intrigues me is the systemic issues that we never even talk about in much of this safety literature, and especially what we call frame it as contemporary safety sciences. I see a huge gap where nobody really wants to talk about the power relations,
Yeah.
and in that sense, I find your work very very powerful. Actually, yes.
Hmm. That's right. Safety science is still in the weeds, really, and missing the big picture. It's all about power, and no amount of safety science is going to make a difference until we can impact the power relations. And as you probably know, my thesis at the moment, I'm trying to fine tune it. It's too easy to say that profit takes precedence over safety, but it does. But it doesn't help to say that. So the way I'm trying to argue at the moment is that the profit is production and profit is an overwhelming drive in large corporations, and left to itself, it will have very negative consequences for safety. So what we must do is develop strategies for developing countervailing power. so that there can be a contest at the highest level between safety and production. So that's a lot of what I'm on about and now. And essentially what that means is having a powerful safety function within a corporation, which is headed at the very top of the corporation and has not just advisory role at lower levels in the organization, but authority to intervene at lower levels in the corporation. And so that's the kind of argument. In fact, that's what I'll be speaking about today.
Excellent. I hear David Harvey in your work, in the kind of work you do, very a critique of neoliberalism, basically, in many ways. That you want to talk about the systemic issues, then you have to reimagine capitalism in some ways, and
Yeah.
it's very
Yeah.
interesting. Yes, I've
So,
already.
today it's just an audio recording, isn't it?
That's right. Yes. So I will be recording the session. We'll talk for about maybe you will maybe you have something to present, so you can go on for about whatever time it takes you, 25, 30 minutes, and then we'll give about 15 minutes to people to ask any questions. Normally, there's very little interaction you see from the other side because people take some time to reflect, but occasionally you have some good questions. So I'll just let people ask any questions and then we'll wrap it up by within 45 minutes. We will finish it off.
All right.
Would that be okay
now,
for you?
Yeah, that's fine by me. So they will ask me directly. Or will you moderate those questions?
No, it will come in the chat box. So I'll pick those questions and I'll just ask you from there.
Oh, okay.
So,
you
yeah,
will
I will. Definitely. Yes. So,
okay.
So yeah, expect about 15 minutes or so of interaction, but will mostly be,
That's fine. I understand these things are quite unpredictable. And okay, that's good. Now you will record it. And did you say you want me to record it as well?
I think it's working fine. The voice quality is really good. So we'll just leave it there. No need to overcomplicate it. So yeah, I'm happy with that.
All right. Okay.
I'll take the risk.
Because I haven't done that before, but I was checking yesterday on my screen, and I've got two ways of recording. I can record onto my computer, or I can record into the cloud. And I wasn't sure which one. I guess once it's in the cloud, you have less control over it.
Yeah, that's another thing. Yes. But it also feels a little bit safer because sometimes if your hard drive doesn't cooperate with you, then you have very little backup.
So, all right, but you don't want me to record. That's fine.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, and but we're going live at 7 o'clock. Is that right?
That's right. In about 6 minutes.
In 6 minutes time.
That's right. Yes.
And what's the time where you are?
It's 7:55 in the evening. So
okay, right, yeah, okay, 11 hours. All right. So we need, and so people may be tuning in at that time. Okay. Do you have do you have a way of knowing how many people are tuned in?
So we've got about 75, 80 people registered, but experience tells me only 50% of them normally turn up. So expect about 35, 40 people or so.
Okay, and you can tell how many people are online, can you?
That's right. Yes.
Okay, good.
I can send you the mailing list if it helps at all to see who really attended the session.
Oh, later? That would be interesting. Yes, I'd like to know that. Yeah.
I categorically actually ask people not to attend if they because there'll be a podcast, because what happens is people just book for the sake of it and never turn up. So if you tell them there's a podcast available later on, then they are more at ease.
So you got quite a following building up then there. That's good. It's quite a little business you're running. That's great.
It's I didn't find much meaning in the work that I was doing for about 7 years. So I thought I'm writing a book right now on the Costa Concordia case, but also the other thing that interests me is this whole idea of upward communication in organizations. And that's something that I'm very, very interested in. And I read your chapter on safety reporting systems. Um, I would love to share my thoughts with you, maybe perhaps in another
Yes.
opportunity. Yes.
Mhm.
Uh,
Good. That um, your system that you directed me to, I've forgotten what it's called now.
Confide us.
Um,
Yes.
it didn't strike me as an upward reporting system, but more as a communication tool amongst peers. And so that's why I said it's rather like a community of practice. Have you come across that term, community of practice? Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. Miss with Wenger, I've read the book. It's a superb
Mm.
book. Yes,
So that's it seemed to me what was going on. And the nice thing about it, I think when the concept of community of practice was first introduced, it wasn't supported by technology in the way it is now. And so you've got this sort of instantaneous community there, which can be extremely valuable. The example you had struck me, examples you put up seemed very useful. It's a marvelous tool, isn't it?
well, it takes a lot to create that space in the first place for people to have those conversations. So I'm not up for technology so much. It's really about how you create those conversations. That shift, what Habermas calls it, going from instrumental rationality towards communicative rationality, which is people meet in a space and they have some shared values. And they like to share their perspective because they feel that by sharing perspectives you can come to some meaningful conclusions.
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
and that is the bit that really interests me.
yeah. And not just perspective, it's also knowledge, because I think if people have some knowledge on a particular topic and they can share it, it gives them a sense of that they're valued, that they're powerful. Yeah. Interesting to hear you talking about Habermas, a sociologist. So, I mean, I'm familiar with his work, but and most of those sociologists I don't have a lot of time for because they're far too general. And I've spent a lot of my life trying to get a bit closer to reality than those guys are. Yeah.
Yes, yes, absolutely. In fact, that work only became apparent to me after starting this journey. So it's only
Yeah.
about few months ago I bumped into this literature from Habermas. So, but wow,
Okay.
this is very interesting. This is exactly what we are
Yeah.
trying
Yeah.
to.
It's philosophically very interesting, and sociology as a whole is fascinating. Um, philosophically and intellectually. The challenge is to make it applicable in industry, and that's what I've been trying to do, as you know.
You're doing. I mean, I love the accessibility in your writing. The simplicity with which you explain things is phenomenal. I mean, it takes a lot. I mean, it's very easy for academics to make things or come up with very difficult way of communicating, but it's
Yeah.
a real art to make it accessible. And I just value your writing a lot.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's something I really, it's very important to me. If my reader doesn't understand what I'm saying, then it's my failure. And that's the philosophy I work with. And so I spend a lot of time trying to imagine myself into the reader's position. What I want is an intelligent, committed reader, someone who's interested in finding out what I have to say. And if that's all I assume about the reader, that they will give me the time, they will read what I have to say. And if they give that to me, then I want to give back to them something which they will understand. Mm.
Excellent. Such nice thoughts. I'll open up the floor. I don't know I can't see anyone, but I will just start the webinar and hopefully we will start to see people coming in. So here we go. 1, 2, 3, start.
So I've just stopped the video.
No, you can be in the video. That's no problem.
Oh, okay.
Yes. I'll just let people join. Takes about a minute or so, and then we can start. Is it usual for you to get up at this time, this early, or?
Oh, yes, yes. It's absolutely. Mm. I often go off to my local gym at this time.
Okay, great. Andrew, I think we can start then. There's about 25 people or so and slowly start to build up. So I think we are good to go. Maybe to start with, you can give us an introduction, a little bit, just briefly about yourself. I think you're very well known, but it'd be nice to have a light introduction before we start.
Well, okay. Well, greetings to you all. My name is Andrew Hopkins. As you probably know, I'm fascinated by the world of work and industry, and I bring a sociological perspective to that. I'm a sociologist. I've spent most of my life at the Australian National University in Canberra, and some of you will know of some of my books. So it's a pleasure to be here today.
Great. Thanks. And we are also very excited to have you. Andrew, would you like to give us an introduction to what is it that you want to talk about today?
Yes, certainly. Thanks, Nippin. It's quite an opportunity you give me because I'd like to speak about my latest book, which is called Organising for Safety: How Structure Creates Culture. And in some respects, that encapsulates an argument that I've been making in many of my books for years, but I'm making it in a more concentrated way here than I have previously. So let me start by saying, suppose you want to create a certain culture in your organization, say a culture that emphasizes process safety or operational excellence, or whatever it might be you're seeking to create. And the argument of my book, in a nutshell, is that to do this, you need to set up the appropriate organizational structure. It's that structure which will give you the culture that you want. Now, before I develop that, I just want to acknowledge that this is a controversial argument, that there are other points of view around. And the leading one, which I want to just mention, is that the way you create a culture is by running educational campaigns, the aim of which is to change the hearts and minds of people, to change the way they think, to change their values. And that's a very frequent strategy which organizations adopt when they are seeking to change the culture of their organization. I'll give you one example. It comes from the petroleum company Shell. A number of years ago now, they set out to change their culture, increase their focus on operational excellence. And they ran what they called a Hearts and Minds campaign. It was based upon the work of Patrick Hudson. Some of you will know his work, and in particular his notion of the organizational maturity ladder, or the safety culture ladder, which divides the cultures of organizations into 5 different categories. The lowest one is, I think, pathological, and the highest one is generative, which simply means a high functioning safety culture. So their aim was to move their organization up that ladder. And they did this by running their campaign. They put all their employees, 250,000 employees, through an educational campaign. And it was successful in some respects. People learnt the language of the maturity scale. They learnt about pathological cultures and generative cultures. They could use that language, but nothing changed. Nothing changed significantly in the organization. And Patrick Hudson, the author of this approach, wrote later an analysis of it. And what he said was that nothing changed because the organizational structure hadn't changed. What they needed to do was to set in place systems of reward and recognition, which would encourage those behaviors which they were seeking to create. But they hadn't done that, so nothing had changed. And there are many other stories. BP had a similar experience, which I won't talk about now. But that's the background, I guess, which leads me to think that it's structural change, organizational change, which is vital. So I want to give you some examples of what I'm talking about, what this means. The first one comes from NASA, the National Aeronautical and Space Administration in the US. It concerns the Space Shuttle Columbia. That shuttle in 2003 was destroyed when it returned to Earth, and 7 astronauts died. What happened was that pieces of the cladding external cladding of an external fuel tank, foam cladding, fell off the fuel tank at the time of launch and hit the shuttle, hit and dented the surface of the shuttle. Now, this happened routinely at launch, and so there were a lot of these dings on the shuttle. And it certainly wasn't the intention of the designers, but because it happened routinely without damage, it had been normalized. This deviation, this what I would call anomaly, had been normalized, and it was now seen as an acceptable risk. Now, on the occasion in question, for this particular launch in 2003, a piece of foam fell off the external fuel tank and hit the leading edge of the wing of the shuttle and made a hole in that leading edge, so that when the shuttle returned to the Earth's atmosphere, the air rushed into that hole and heated up the shuttle and destroyed the shuttle. Now, there was a major inquiry into this, the Columbia Accident Investigation Inquiry, and they were very, it was, I guess, a recognition that the culture of the organization was the problem. That was their primary focus. They said that, they described it as a broken culture. The culture of NASA was faster, better, cheaper, and no mention of safety there, just faster, better, cheaper. So that from a safety point of view, this was a broken culture. Now, it's interesting to me that that's their analysis. The root cause of the problem is a broken culture. So what's their solution? How do you change a culture? This is why this is such an important example to me. The way you change that culture is by making an organizational change. And so what they recommended, what the board recommended, was the creation of a particular organizational entity within NASA, a technical engineering authority, which would sit outside of the shuttle launch organization. So it was not constrained by questions of cost or schedule, which dominated the operation of the schedule of the launch organization, shuttle organization, would sit outside that and had the authority to intervene within the shuttle organization on technical questions. So it would determine what was anomalous and what was not, and what needed to be done about anomalies. And that would ensure that the kind of normalization which occurred in the Columbia case would not occur again. So that's a very good example, I think, of what I mean by organizational change, the kind of change which is needed to create the culture you want. It's interesting that the board drew on the US submarine Navy as its primary example. This is a much celebrated case which many theorists go back to, because in 1963, that's more than 50 years ago, the first nuclear submarine was introduced into the Navy, and they lost a nuclear submarine in a peacetime accident, and they realized they couldn't afford to do this. It turns out they had been losing submarines in peacetime accidents at a remarkable rate, about 1 every 3 years, since in the previous 50 odd years. So a colossal rate of submarine loss they put up with, and they realized they couldn't continue. So they introduced this program of SubSafe, which was again, an external organization standing outside of the submarine operations, still within Navy, of course, but outside of submarine operations, and with the authority to intervene within the submarine program, its normal operations. And since that time, there have been no submarine losses, with one possible exception, but basically no submarine losses in peacetime since. So that's, if you like, a piece of empirical evidence for how effective that kind of intervention is or can be. So that's really what lies behind my view that a culture of operational excellence does depend upon having that kind of organizational structure, where there is a technical organization separated from the routine day-to-day operation, the organization that runs day-to-day operations, but that technical organization has authority to intervene in the way I've described. Now, the main case study in my book is BP. I've studied BP, the oil company BP, after Macondo. Macondo was the name of the well, the oil well that blew up. There was a blowout in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico. And what's really interesting about this case study is it's a before and after, because they entirely changed their organizational structure as a result of the Macondo accident. That accident killed, I think, 11 people, but it also did more than 60 billion. It cost more than 60 billion US dollars to BP. It almost destroyed the company. And it's quite interesting that it's when companies have a near-death experience like this that they make the kinds of organizational changes that BP made. So let me just talk about this before and after comparison. Before the accident, BP was a highly decentralized organization. It was probably the most decentralized of all the oil and gas companies. So its operations in the Gulf of Mexico, of course, it's a worldwide company, but it had operations in the Gulf of Mexico. And that operation in the Gulf of Mexico functioned as pretty much an autonomous company. It was responsible to head office for making money, of course. But other than that, the central corporate structure did not exercise control over what was going on in the Gulf of Mexico, and in particular, did not exercise any control over the quality of engineering in its Gulf of Mexico operations. So its engineers in the Gulf of Mexico were under the control of a very business-oriented, commercially oriented, independent business unit. And what that meant was that these engineers were under constant pressure to save money and to cut corners. And that's really one of the root causes of what happened, because when they're under those pressures, they do cut corners and they stop asking what is good engineering practice. And they start asking a subtly different question, which is, what is good enough? And I hope you can understand that's a very different question, which leads to the erosion of quality over time. So I would describe the culture of BP in the Gulf of Mexico, the culture of the engineers, as a cavalier culture, or a careless culture, if you like, careless with respect to major accident risk. Now, to dig into that a little more deeply, to understand why that happened, we have to understand the reporting structures within the organization. So those engineers were reporting directly to line managers. And the result of that was that their performance agreements were with line managers whose primary concern was profit and production. And so their bonuses were determined by cost cutting and production. And if that's the way you reward your engineers, then over time that becomes their mindset. And that is what had happened in the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so that decentralized structure in the way that I've just described was really a very fundamental cause. And clearly BP thought so too. And that's why they changed their structure following that accident. And their new structure was one in which the engineers, wherever they were in the world, were under centralized control from head office in London. So that was no longer were they answerable to local commercial managers. They were providing services to local commercial managers, but they were answerable up an engineering functional line to a chief engineer, in effect, in London. And their career prospects will be determined by how well they performed in that context, not by commercial success in the local operation. So that was one factor. And the other one was the safety and operational risk function, which they created. So they had a centralized operational risk. Means in that context, it means major accident risk. So they created a function called safety and operational risk, or safety and major accident risk, which was run out of London, and it had enormous control over what was going on in BP's far-flung empire. It had several hundred employees, this function, who were embedded in the business units around the world and sat on the management teams at various levels and could influence decision-making at those various levels, but who reported up their own separate functional line to head office in London, up that safety and operational risk line. So it operated very much like the technical engineering authority recommended by the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. And so to me, that's a very important model. And the most recent example of that, by the way, is Boeing. As you know, Boeing had lost two Boeing 737 MAX aircraft just a couple of years ago. And again, the fundamental cause of that was the decentralized operation. The business units within Boeing were operating more or less autonomously. And Boeing has now changed that structure. So its engineers no longer report to the local business unit, or whatever the business unit may be, but they report up a separate line to a chief engineer who is independent of any of those business units. So they've learnt the same lesson and implemented that same lesson. There are some qualifications I need to make to this argument now. That a structure like an organizational structure like this, like the safety and operational risks function in BP, cannot guarantee safety. This is not a guarantee. It will improve your chances of operating safely, but it's not a guarantee. And BP's had some significant near misses since introducing this new system, but it hasn't had another major accident. It had two major accidents before introducing this new system. First, the Macondo accident, and 5 years earlier than that, we had the Texas City refinery disaster, which killed 15 people and cost the company many billions of dollars. But since the reorganization, it has not had a major accident. Now, that's probably not yet statistically significant, but it's very encouraging for BP and for those who are following the BP model. But it can be, this organizational structural model I'm talking about can be undermined in various ways. The most obvious one is if you don't resource it properly, it won't function properly. And so that's the thing you have to watch out for. You have to be aware that this is expensive. People will resist this model because it will cost money. And so that's one of the problems with trying to introduce a model like this. A second, if you like, potential underminer is the bonus arrangements which operate in companies. If you reward your people whose primary function is risk management, if you reward those people on the basis of company productivity and profit, you undermine their capacity to perform their risk management job with integrity. And that's, there are many examples that support what I've just said, but I don't have time to talk about that now. I think also if your organization is one which discourages the reporting of bad news, if it does not encourage the reporting of bad news, this will also tend to undermine whatever systems you have in place. And finally, the attitude of the board of the company is critically important. If the board's primary concern is to protect itself from bad news, then nothing's going to save the organization in the long run. I mean, I've had the experience talking to people on boards where I realize that that's their primary concern. They don't want me to give them the bad news. They want to be protected from the bad news. Okay, so I think, but the point I'm making then is that companies which have had these near-death experiences introduce the kinds of changes that I'm talking about. And that to me is a very powerful piece of evidence in support of what I'm saying. But before I finish, I want to just broaden the discussion a bit and say that this notion that structure, organizational structure creates culture is much broader than safety, and applies in situations which have nothing to do with safety. Let me give you two examples. One concerns a culture which I've studied or had some exposure to in the railways. It's a culture of punctuality, or what is often called on-time running. And it's a very strong culture. It's maintained in all kinds of ways, but it's one of the striking things about the railway system is that on-time running is an absolute value. They don't always succeed, but it's a very powerful drive to run on time. The way I became aware of it was I was studying an accident in a railway system where the driver had been speeding. The cause of the accident was the driver had been speeding. And when we looked into why the driver had been speeding, it was because of the power of this on-time culture. He was running late, so he had to speed, the result of which was a derailment, which killed about 7 people. So the question I then asked myself was, well, where does this come from? The language that they used to describe this was on-time running is king. That was the expression that came up again and again in the inquiry. So where does it come from? And it was the structure of the organization which had created this. They were, first of all, there's public pressure for the trains run on time, very strong public pressure, which is translated into political pressure. Often there are regulators who will even penalize train companies that don't run on time. And so the organization has a whole structure which is designed to get people to run on time. There are inspectors, there's a signaling structure. They record the data on arrival times. They've got to arrive at their destination within 3 minutes. If they don't, there are questions asked. The driver is interviewed. The company will normally monitor arrival times twice a day at peak hours. So they're absolutely onto this. And that's the reason why this culture is paramount. The second example I want to give you is a humorous one in some respects. It's McDonald's, the fast food company. What do we know about McDonald's? First of all, it has a highly decentralized business model. All of its individual outlets are franchises, which means that McDonald's itself as a company is not really too committed to the success or failure of those franchisees. That it's up to them to make money and to be profitable. And if they fail, that's their problem, not really McDonald's. So it's a highly decentralized business model from that point of view. But what's really important to McDonald's is not the survival of any one of those franchise operations. It's the quality, predictability, and the uniformity of the service and the product. And McDonald's controls that very closely and centrally. It has it has a system of inspectors, it has a system of quality control, so that anyone who goes into a McDonald's store anywhere in the world goes through those familiar golden arches, knows what they're going to, the quality of the service, and knows the quality of the product which they're going to be receiving. And so that's the point then, isn't it? That if something's really important to an organization, it will control it centrally. If it's not so important, it will allow a more decentralized approach. So that's the main argument of the book. The book also contains various other critiques along the way. I do a critique of the anarchist school of safety, which I associate with the names of Decker and Holnagel. That school is basically arguing that safety is best left to the workers. And that may be true in some circumstances, but it's certainly not true for major accident risk. I also do a critique of the concept of visible felt leadership, which is a term that's very fashionable at the moment. Critique of behavior-based safety. So you'll find a lot of other kinds of ideas in the book along the way. So I think, Nippin, I'll leave it at that and take whatever questions you may have. Thank you.
Well, thanks to you for taking the time. It's 7 o'clock in the morning in your part of the world. So I'm ever grateful for your time. And what a fascinating insight. Uh, Before I open the floor for questions, I just wanted to clarify the term independence and authority kept coming back in this conversation. And one could argue in some ways that a safety department in most organization actually ha- is independent and seemingly has the authority to do what they're supposed to do. Can you elaborate a little bit on this concept of independence and authority? What kind of authority are we talking about here?
Okay. Yes, some of these very large organizations will have a director of safety who sits on the management board, and in that respect, they have a degree of independence from any of the business units. So that's a tick in that respect. However, they don't exercise real authority. Their role in almost always is ultimately advisory. What you'll find is they'll say, we set the standards, we develop the technical standards in the corporate center. We don't have a role in enforcing them. We do from time to time carry out audits, but our fundamental role when it comes to dealing with the business units is advisory. We are a resource which is available for those units if that's what they want, but it is not our responsibility to ensure compliance with those standards, and we don't have the authority to intervene and shut down an operation if it's not in compliance with the standards. So that's what I mean when I say the role of these safety departments often doesn't have the requisite authority.
Great, thank you very much for that. I will open up. There are a couple of questions here, but you're all encouraged to put your questions here. And Andrew is with us for the next 15 minutes or so. So please feel free if you have any questions. Um, Cindy has a question here. And she's asking, what if the board, by omission or commission, are not interested in or have the know-how to delve into the structure, stroke leadership, and appropriate risk management?
There's a couple of questions there. What if they're not interested? And the other one is they don't have the know-how. Let's deal with the know-how. I think boards that are serious about this will make sure that they have someone on the board who has knowledge and experience with respect to the management of major accident risk. And that's a recommendation that comes out of the UK environment now in the oil and gas industry, that some years ago, the industry committed itself to that proposition. Whether they're complying with it, I'm not really sure, but that's the first thing. And so they need to have someone there who can act as a kind of interpreter. But more than that, and that person then has the capacity and needs to have the authority to dig down into the organization and ask questions and bypass the CEO and get right down to the people that know what's going on, and if need be, ask questions at that level. So the board needs to have that independent source of entree into what's really going on, so that they're not just subject to a whole lot of PR from the CEO who's telling them how good everything is, which unfortunately happens far too often. Now, that what I've just said depends upon the board being interested and committed. So how do we ensure a board is interested and committed to doing this? I think ultimately it's a question of what are the forces that work in the wider society that will force them to take that interest. You can't rely on them to do this by themselves. It depends ultimately on consequences, on prosecutions, on reputation. If companies realize that their reputation is at stake, or if their shareholders are starting to put pressure on them, then they start to take an interest. We see this in the mining industry now with the tailings dam failures which have occurred around the world in the mining industry. Investors are now putting a lot of pressure on boards to take effective action in relation to those failures, and things are now changing for that reason. So it depends upon the external environment as to the extent to which these boards will act. And so I'm a great believer in the need for the possibility of some kind of legal response in these situations. It needn't be too punitive, but it needs to be it needs to be there so that people are aware that this is a possibility.
Great. Very, very interesting. I would, there's a few other questions. So I just want to make sure that at least some of them are addressed. Uh, there's another attendee who says that excellent presentation. Your book is a must read for leaders in high hazard organizations. Question: considering that decentralized organizational structure can adversely impact process safety and the prevention of major accidents, what is the role of regulatory agencies on this topic? In your opinion, how can regulators influence or act on this issue?
Okay, that's a very important question. Regulators traditionally have not focused on organizational structure. They've focused on technical questions, and focused on specific hazards and how well specific hazards are being managed and whether the critical controls are in place. These more detailed kinds of technical questions. Increasingly, I think regulators are recognizing that organizational matters, and in particular organizational structures, are, in a sense, the root cause of what is going on. And they are slowly re-equipping themselves and retooling themselves to be able to ask probing questions at that level. And I think that's what I would be recommending, that regulators start. I don't think they have the answers at this stage as to what is the best organizational structure, but they're beginning to realize that this is the critical question. And the starting point would be to ask questions of the companies. Precisely how are you managing safety, and what are you doing to ensure that production and cost reduction priorities or imperatives are not taking precedence over safety? Demonstrate to us that you have those production and cost reduction imperatives under some kind of control. And so that's, I think, what I would be saying to regulators. I would support that direction.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because one of the problems, Andrew, we have in the maritime world is that regulation and enforcement, by and large, has been handed over to classification societies and flags of convenience. So it's extremely very hard to exercise that kind of control, because you have very conflicting goals between, obviously you want to retain them as your customers, and you also want to enforce regulation, and the two are not compatible. So independence in that sense is stands in direct contrast with authority in some ways.
Yes, that's right. Yes, yes. Mm.
Excellent. There's another question here from Andy. He says, who owns the risk and who is accountable? Is the external overseeing organization or the central board?
Who owns the risk? Interesting question. Um, I guess that's a legal question, isn't it? Really, and at law, it's the whoever controls the operation owns the risk. That's the situation. Um, if you control the organization and you are creating the risk, then you are the owner of the risk, and it's your responsibility to deal with. Now, if the risk is something which is resulting in daily problems like lost time injuries, then that's a sensible approach, because we can say to the organization, your injury rate's too high, you're not controlling this risk, and if you don't do so properly, you'll be subject to some sort of legal consequence. Because so that ultimately it's the law which will enforce that notion of who is responsible for those risks. In the case of routine injuries and routine risks, that makes some sense. In the case of rare but catastrophic events, it's much harder to insist that the owner of the operation is the sole locus of responsibility, because they just don't know. And so that's why it becomes more important that regulators take a strong role in directing companies as to how to control these catastrophic risks. That doesn't make the regulator the owner of the risk. It's still the company which is the owner of the risk, but the regulator has a role in ensuring that happens, because ultimately the regulator can prosecute companies for failure to control those risks.
And if I may add, the position of one of the regulators, one of the examples of regulators I've seen is that uh, it's the position that if one of the employees, the so-called inspector or the surveyor, does not find a problem with the asset and something goes wrong, then the regulator takes the position that that specific inspector or employee should be prosecuted. So that's a very interesting position I've seen of late, criminalization of safety inspectors in the event of things going wrong. Interesting what you said about the control of risk and the ownership of the risk. Organizations just shy away from it's extremely difficult.
And
There's another,
that's can I just come back on that? That's you're quite right in what you say. That's a very counterproductive strategy for the regulator, because what it means is that the inspectors will find something wrong on every visit. It may be a trivial matter, and they'll highlight those trivial matters because they're easily identified as regulatory violations, but they may not be the root cause of the problem that is going on in that organization at all.
but it keeps the equilibrium, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
it doesn't ruffle any feathers, and you've got your job done. You got a report that was expected from you. So it's really a fascinating topic to discuss. Um, and this is an interesting question from Steve. He says, "Are there any aspects of Decker, Stroke, Holnagel, etc., work that does overlap with or support your view about the role of structure in organizational culture?"
Um, well, it's very interesting. If you read Decker, you'll find that he says quite specifically that his analysis does not apply to aircraft safety. Decker is a pilot. He's a qualified pilot. And at one point in one of his books, he says, you can't simply leave it to pilots to decide how to fly. There are checklists which they are required to go through, and they must go through those things. And it makes no sense to say to them, well, you do what you like with the checklist. So he says, in that context, centralized control of what's going on is vital to safety. So he is careful, I think, in his written work to qualify what he's saying, and to say that it applies in relation to more mundane and more trivial kinds of risks. So, for example, he's done work on safety in supermarkets. And in that context, he says there's far too much bureaucracy being applied to the checkout operators and the people who pack the shelves. It's much better to let them work out what the hazards are and to work out what the best prevention strategies are. And in that context, he may well be right. I'm not an expert in that area, but he may well be right there. So I have no quarrel with that approach. What my concern is when people who read Decker and then go away and say, we are going to apply this in the oil and gas industry. We think this is great. We are going to expect that oil and gas workers can somehow or other manage the major risk which they confront. That's nonsense. It's just nonsense. So, so there is, I'm not in total contradiction to Decker at all, but I think some of the people who use his work have taken it too far. And of course, the same would apply to Holnagel.
Great. Thank you for the comment. Really appreciate it, because I think very little is understood about the underlying assumptions of all these so-called contemporary safety sciences that is emerging right now. And it's very important to challenge. And I think you have dedicated a chapter in your book to that. To all those who are listening, I would encourage you to read this book. It's a really good book, and it gives you a very holistic perspective about things, and particularly from a power relation perspective. And very accessible, as most of Andrew's books are. Written in a very lay language. But Andrew makes it very clear at the start of the book that if you're not the CEO of a company, then this book is not for you. You should be recommending this book to people up in the organization, which is the purpose of this book, isn't it? Yes.
Yes, the so-called C-suite, the people at the top of the organization, they're the ones who pull the levers, and so this message has to be conveyed to them. And so if you are in an organization not at that level, what my hope is that you'll read the book and find a way to pass it to your superior and recommend it be passed up the line. I've seen this happen before with some of my other books, that they start at some middle level in the organization and then they get passed up to the CEO. with the recommendation that he take this seriously. And this book, I hope this book can be used in that way.
Yes, I thoroughly enjoyed it. There's another question, which is that what about small organizations? They do not have this kind of structure described. There is no board, only the owner. Still, the same questions of independence and decision making regarding safety aspects may appear. So, how do you deal with that?
Well, I don't in that book. So that's a limitation of the book. I'm not focused on small business. Why? Because partly because small business typically don't deal with these major hazards in the way that many big businesses do. Typically, they can't kill hundreds of people. And so there isn't quite the same urgency. But still, the same issues apply. As soon as if the business is big enough to begin to for people to specialize in certain areas, then you need to ensure that you've got someone in the business who has the authority and the power to specialize in safety, management of risk of all sorts, and to intervene within the organization. So what I'm talking about becomes progressively more important as the size of the organization increases.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Another question. Great presentation. Thank you. In the rail industry, do you have experience with the on time running culture being affected by the national culture?
By the national culture? Oh, that's an interesting question, isn't it? People often say, I've seen this in the oil and gas industry. We are operating in country X where the national culture is different, and therefore we're not having the success that we have in the country from which we come. The national culture is an impediment. And I don't think that's the case. I think the case is that if you are serious about creating a certain kind of organizational culture, you will do so, and you will succeed in overriding whatever elements of the national culture stand in your way. And so, for example, I know that Shell was at some point thinking about constructing vessels in a Korean shipyard, and they were worried about the so-called national culture, which accepted a high rate of industrial fatalities. And eventually they said, well, we're just not going to accept that. We will insist that the ships being constructed for us, there will be a zero fatality rate. And if there are fatalities, we will insist, as part of the contract, that senior managers will be dismissed. And as soon as they introduced that, things changed. The culture changed because the structure of the organization changed in that respect. And so, yeah, national cultures are powerful, but within organizations, the organization can override that.
Absolutely. And I've seen examples of that too, Andrew. In fact, a number of examples of that. So thank you for that. We are at the end of the webinar. We have done our 45 minutes, and that's what I promised also to Andrew when he was very kind to accept the invitation. So in the interest of time, I would like to thank everyone for their wonderful contribution and some really good questions asked, but most importantly, to Professor Andrew Hopkins for joining us from this far at such an early stage in the morning. It's a wonderful thing to meet you, although not in person, but I really enjoyed talking to you and meeting you for the first time in person on the camera. Yes, and I hope we can meet again sometime.
Okay, thank you, Nippin. My pleasure.
Great. Thank you everyone for joining, and have a nice evening and or a nice day ahead, whichever part of the world you are in.
Okay.
Great. Thank you for joining us. Really enjoyed talking to you. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Nippin. All right. I'm off to have my breakfast now.
All right. Okay. Enjoy it. Bye-bye. Bye.